This is a webinar covering our Q2 2024 Internet Security Report, so we can share some global threat trends that are happening based on that report. Might feel weird talking about Q2 during Q4, but do know we're always, we don't get the results of Q2 until Q3, so we're writing the Q2 report during Q3. And that means we usually have this webinar at the beginning of the next quarter, but this one's coming a tad late for scheduling reasons. But that said, to jump right in before we talk about the report, my name's Corey Nachreiner. I'm now the Chief Security, or if you please, the Chief Information Security Officer of WatchGuard. Been here for many decades and used to be the CTO as well. But with me is also my right-hand favorite man, even though we're always making fun of each other. Why don't you introduce yourself, Mark?
Yeah, literally always. So Mark the Liberty of the Director of Security Operations. So while Corey attends the meetings, I do all the work for the team. But
Thanks.
joking
You're
aside,
welcome, by the way. If you, I don't think
I
one day you'll be going to those meetings. I don't think you'll like them as much as the fun stuff.
definitely appreciate that. But joking aside, the Internet Security Report every quarter is a collective team effort with contributions from not just Corey and I, but uh, folks on the security operations and WatchGuard Labs teams as well too. We absolutely would not get any of this done without the help of everyone researching and contributing and analyzing the data that we get a look at every single quarter.
Yeah, and I'll have to say, just to repeat on Mark's, that I would say the authors you see are the co-authors are really the meat of the report, although Mark does a DNS section. Me and Mark started the report, and it used to be a two-man show where we wrote everything, and we've written every section before. But Trevor, Ryan, and Josh really fill out most of the report now. So they're not here, but no, it's a lot of hard work from them. If you've been to our Internet Security Report webinars before, it's a pretty similar agenda every single time. The report, if you don't know, is based on product feedback. We take the feedback or telemetry we get from our network security and endpoint security products, and we report on it. So the report starts with something called Firebox feed trends. And if you're a customer, you might know that Firebox is our network security portion of our products. So we'll start with the top malware and network attacks we see from the network, as well as it has a tool called DNS Watch, which is a DNS firewall service that reports the top malicious domains, whether they be compromised networks, phishing, drive-by download sites, whatever that your users might click on. But now that we also sell endpoint products for the last 5 or 6 years, we also covered the top endpoint trends through a WatchGuard EPDR and our older AD360 product, which are really both the same thing. And we'll go in a deep dive in some of the endpoint activity and how threats get on the endpoint. But really, as usual, the whole point of this report isn't necessarily just to highlight all the bad stuff the attackers are doing, but to figure out the trends that they're currently focused on so that we can make sure to help our customers and anyone listening to this webinar institute the right protection tips. And with that said, I already gave a small intro of the Firebox feed, but I'll hand it to Mark to talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, and if you're a returnee to this webinar or our report, none of this will be new to you, but for the new folks on here, just a quick overview. When we're talking about the Firebox feed, we're talking about our anonymized opt-in telemetry feed that we get from our network security appliances deployed at customer locations around the world. If you manage a Firebox, which if you're on this webinar, there's a decent chance you or someone in your company does, you can opt in to sharing this threat telemetry with us. It's under the general settings for the device. It says send device feedback to WatchGuard. And what that does is anytime one of the security services on the device blocks a threat, it packages up a report with some information about that threat and sends it back to us, where we can view it, analyze those trends at a larger level across tens of thousands of devices around the world, and really get a good picture of different attack tactics and techniques that threat actors are using targeting small and mid-sized enterprises everywhere. It's broken up and or made up of telemetry from really a few main sources. We've got our 3 layers of anti-malware service in there. So gateway antivirus being the legacy signature-based anti-malware service. You'll hear us talk throughout this webinar and the report how signature-based anti-malware is still a requirement for organizations, but it alone isn't enough to catch all of the threats that are out there. So we've got two other layers of anti-malware too. Intelligent AV is our machine learning, or I guess now we have to call it artificial intelligence antivirus engine. And then APT Blocker is our behavioral analysis engine that uses a cloud sandbox to detonate files, watch their behaviors, and make a conclusive thumbs up or thumbs down on whether it's good or bad. So beyond malware, we also analyze our network attacks from the intrusion protection service. So signature-based threat detection service that can look for um, exploits against not just like network server infrastructure, but even clients as well too. Like if one of your users is running an out-of-date version of Firefox and connects to a watering hole attack website, IPS could protect against exploits against the browser too. And beyond browsers, anything network connected can be protected with that service. So we get a pretty good view of network attacks from that service. And like Corey mentioned, rounding it out is DNS Watch, our DNS firewalling service, where we can get a view of three main categories that we talk about in the report: domains associated with malware attacks or malware delivery. Yay, thumbs up, Siri. Domains associated with compromised websites, where attackers have gone after a legitimate site to host something illegitimate. And then phishing domains, which should be self-explanatory. But with that, let's go ahead and dive into the first main stats and the main trends we were seeing from the malware section of the Firebox feed. While we'll get into individual threats in just a little bit, one of the first things we like to talk about is just a high-level global view of what does the malware threat landscape look like from a network security perspective. And interestingly, the average number of malware detections actually dropped around 24% this quarter when compared to last quarter, but we're still seeing around 935 or so average malware detections per device out there over the course of the quarter, which is still a considerable amount of malware per device out there that's being blocked by these devices. When we look at the specific trends for threats, there was an interesting mix this quarter where our detections from the signature-based gateway antivirus service actually went down around 35% when compared to last quarter. And our even machine learning or AI-based anti-malware service was also down around 37% when compared to last quarter. But that was kind of counterweighted by a massive surge in threats that were detected by our behavioral analysis engine, APT Blocker, which went up 100 and almost 70% in the quarter. And this shows a bit of a shift, pretty dramatic shift this quarter in threats moving towards more evasive techniques that can get past signature-based protections and even AI-based protections in some cases. But the main takeaway from this is it's extremely difficult to get past behavioral-based detection capabilities because at the end of the day, malware is doing something malicious. There is some red flag or combination of red flags and behavior you can get from a malicious payload. And when you detonate that in a controlled sandbox and just watch the behaviors, you can often flag and catch these threats with pretty good accuracy. So overall, malware down slightly for the quarter, mostly driven by a pretty sizable drop in the signature-based detections, but a pretty sizable increase in threats that were caught by our behavioral-based detections.
Yeah, before we move on, if I were just to round out, I don't think we in the endpoint section give you as much of a summary, but just so you know, malware was down overall. It wasn't just in the network section, but endpoint malware detection decreased 39%. So this was, I don't think we've seen this that many quarters. We've had a couple quarters previously where something like network malware would go up and endpoint malware would go down, or vice versa. Network malware would go down and endpoint malware would go up. And that might be kind of more expected. If you think about it, if you do have users behind a network device, if the network device is catching more stuff, it's less likely that the endpoint malware would have to trigger, and vice versa. If the network was missing more, for whatever reason, the endpoint would have to catch up. But in this case, almost all our malware, or all malware, did go down, other than that APT blocker in general. More
So what does that mean, Corey?
sophisticated
Did we
malware going up.
Did we solve everything? Did we save the
Yeah,
day?
yeah. We've won, guys. Hackers no longer are I have no clue. One of the things we wish we had more data on is sometimes why these trends happen. There were takedowns during Q2, so maybe some was associated with a slight volume drop from that, but it's hard for us to say. The one number I like to give is we've mentioned this before, but our report now focuses on per firebox malware trends. So that 935 number is, just one firebox. But if you want the crazy big number, we extrapolate that if all currently active, meaning still have a license fireboxes, there's millions, at least a million fireboxes out there without licenses too. But if all the active licensed fireboxes had all our security services turned on, we would have blocked in Q2 361,312,985 malware instances. So while that under 1,000 might seem small for a single box, realize our network of fireboxes was over 361 million malware detections.
Okay, so malware is not done then. Got it.
Yeah, yeah. It's when we say it's decreased in relation to already being super, super freaking high. Another trend we talk about is our 0-day malware number. In fact, we probably should add malware back to this slide because this is not a lot of people, when you think of 0-day, you think of network exploits, some sort of vulnerability in software that has been found often by a bad guy, but it could be a researcher too. But if it's found but not patched, it's called a 0-day. But in this case, we're not talking about that. We're talking about 0-day malware. And what that attests to is what Marc was talking about. Signature based protection will catch a lot of threats, but it misses things. And anything that's missed by a signature requires more proactive detection, like that artificial intelligence or behavioral based anti malware that we have on the fireboxes. So all we basically do is we compare, just so you know, technically the way our anti-malware works is gateway antivirus, which is our signature-based thing, always checks first. By definition, if gateway antivirus didn't find anything, it then goes to our intelligent AV machine learning, and the final thing it does is behavioral analysis and APT blocker. But by definition, if anything gets to IAV or APT blocker, that means it caught past our signature based detection in GAV. So we used that to come up with this 0-day number. And as you can see, of that just under 1,000 threats per firebox, 58% required IAV or APT blocker to detect. So they evaded signature-based malware. They were more sophisticated or just newer than average. Oops, I'm not sure what button I pressed to make that big, but there you have it. We also measured this 0-day malware not just normally, but with TLS, which means over encrypted connections. 95 to 99% of the internet now, Google always changes their numbers, is encrypted. Almost no websites you go to are HTTP only. They're all HTTPS. That means, when we're looking at all traffic, just HTTP, we're probably not seeing the main picture. And that's why we like actually paying attention to specifically fireboxes that have TLS decryption turned on, because we see a different story. Now, this is kind of an unusual story this quarter in that over encryption, advanced malware was down. Only 44% of malware was kind of this 0-day malware over TLS. That has not been the case on almost every quarter before. Usually you see more sophisticated malware in TLS. Not sure what caused that decline, but for once, the malware seen over encrypted connections seems to be more basic, and a lot of it was caught by signatures. One just note while we're talking about TLS decryption, I would say just over 20% of fireboxes that report to us do it. It's a free ability feature that you can get with fireboxes, even without adding our additional security services like basic or total security. And yet, very few people do it. I think you should. As I mentioned, 95 to 99% of web traffic is encrypted. if you're not using our TLS or SSL decryption, you're basically not able to apply things like IPS, anti-malware, and other things to normal traffic, not at least in the best possible manner. So we highly recommend you turn it on. This quarter, maybe there was slightly less sophisticated malware through that channel, but normally it's the opposite. Moving on, why don't you talk about malware in general, Mark?
Yeah, so in each of our sections, both for malware and network attacks, we don't just look at the high level trends, we also look at some of the specific threats that were percolating up, percolating down, I don't know, within our customers' networks. One of the views we look at is the top malware by volume, which is literally the top 10 malware threats by the number of detections that we had across all of our customers. And this was actually a really busy quarter, in that 7 of the top 10 threats were entirely new for this quarter. That's pretty rare. Normally, we get 1 or 2 new malware variants or new signatures or malware families popping up in here on any given quarter, and generally not this kind of wholesale change of new threats coming in. So that stood out a little bit. In the report, Trevor does a great job in this section of going into each of these individual threats and quite a bit of detail on specifically what they are and how they work. But there's a few that I wanted to at least highlight in this webinar that were interesting. That the top new threat there, that heuristic.mint malware family, is actually a signature that catches the Luma Stealer dropper malware. So it's a botnet that's delivered as a malware as a service, so entirely commoditized, meaning you don't need any malware development skills or infrastructure skills to carry out an attack leveraging this malware as a service variant. And like most info stealers, it's designed to try and steal your credentials or cryptocurrency wallets or any other useful information off of your computer once it executes. You may not be aware that when you save your password into your web browser, like Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer, it's all just saving it locally on your computer, including the decryption keys to retrieve those passwords, because your browser needs to be able to use them. So InfoStealer malware can very easily, once it's gained a foothold on your computer, steal all of your passwords that you've saved out of your web browser if you're not using a password manager. When it comes to a few other threats in there, the trojan.task.disabler, as you may guess from the title, it disables the Windows Task Manager as an evasion technique to try and make it more difficult to respond to this particular threat. One of the variants that we saw was pretty interesting, where it was using a modified version of a anti-malware service called NPAV, which was developed by an India-based anti-malware company, where it looks like they had taken the legitimate installer and injected their malicious code into it to carry out some of these attacks. A couple of the other big ones, LokiBot was a pretty popular threat from attackers these days. The DACIC malware variant in here was a dropper that primarily delivered LokiBot. This one was interesting. It pretends to be an Excel spreadsheet file. It's got an extension .xlsx.exe. So if you're not paying close attention, it's using one of the oldest tricks in the book against Windows victims, where that very last extension generally won't always be displayed. So users might just see .xlsx and think it's an Excel file. There was a hack tool in here called 3Proxy, which is a lightweight proxy service. Attackers can leverage this open source tool in their malware to set up a proxy service and then relay their attacks through compromised devices to go after other devices. You may have seen other reports from other vendors over the last couple of months on this being a really popular tactic for threat actors to carry out like brute force authentication attempts. So it makes sense that this is a popular tool. And then rounding it out, there were 2 fake login pages. So js.fakelogin and malware.fme are malware signatures designed to catch phishing attacks as they're delivered to your web browser. So either malicious JavaScript or even malicious HTML files that we review and block if they might be associated with phishing, which makes sense. Threat actors are increasingly using credential theft as a method to kick off other cybersecurity attacks. When it comes to the top widespread malware, so the threats that are impacting the most individual networks versus just creating the most volume in general, there was only one new addition to this quarter. It was the signature titled HTML.hidden.1, which, just like those last 2 threats I talked about, is designed to catch basically a phishing web page as it's delivered to an endpoint, either through your browser or in some cases even attached to an email that made it into your inbox. In this one, it fakes a Microsoft 365 login form using a adversary in the middle tactic to steal credentials and potentially even circumvent multi-factor authentication in a successful attack. This one was interesting where the malicious file in this case also included like copy paste text from news articles from CNN.com, which is a way to throw off machine learning based malware protections that might analyze the whole file, see a whole bunch of legitimate looking text, and miss that tiny little bit of malicious script or code or whatever in there, and potentially allow it to get through onto the endpoint. But luckily, in this case, this was a threat that we detected and blocked on a wide number of customer networks. But Corey, you want to continue on to the network threats now?
Yeah, for sure, Mark. So now we're moving on to the network threats, which of course are things discovered by WatchGuard's IPS or intrusion prevention. As you can see, on average, we blocked 130 network events during Q2 per firebox. To put that in context, that was a quarter over quarter increase of 32%. So network attacks were up in Q2, and that's an increase of almost 62%, 61.4% year over year, so higher than Q2 last year. On average, all the IPS trends went up a little bit this quarter. One of the things we have is unique detections. IPS triggers on different types of different vulnerabilities in software. And one of the things we look at is how many unique different exploits were leveraged or attempted to be leveraged during Q2. And we saw 446 unique different signatures or exploits being targeted, which is about a 18% increase or just under 18%. Going into the top report by volume, if I can get PowerPoint to move forward, lots of interesting things. One other stat, by the way, is the top signature, which I'll talk about in a second, the number one threat, represented almost one third, 29.3, almost 30% of all IPS detections overall. So that was a very prevalent attack. And I'll talk about that in a second. I will mention in the second place is that, excuse me, Microsoft Exchange Server Remote Code Execution vulnerability that is actually proxy login. You've probably heard us talk about proxy login for about a year, despite being a couple years old. Actually, I'm sorry, it's now like 3 years old. A very old but well-known Exchange vulnerability. Bad guys still have automated means going out and looking to see if they can exploit this online. So proxy login still accounted for about 6% of the network attacks we saw. Going back to the first, though, a lot of you probably have heard of Nginx. It's spelled weird, Ng you speak out, but it's Nginx basically. It's a proxy, a web proxy. A lot of people use it to bounce to their real web server through a lot of different connections, or you can just use it as a web server. Very popular web server. But this vulnerability is actually a slightly older one. I think it's about 5 years old it came out around 2019. A typical kind of buffer overflow memory exploit that could allow code execution. So this was the top by far most detected the threats out there. And a lot of those detections were found in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, or the Asian Pacific area, with much less of it being maybe, just about a third being found in America. So not sure why this has come back being such an old vulnerability, but Nginx is definitely very popular. So that was one of the big signatures. Another interesting one that never was on a report before is .cms. CMS stands for Content Management System, and .cms is something that's used in a lot of products like Adobe Cold Fusion, to name just one of them. And again, this was a vulnerability that allowed access to lots of stuff on the web server. The rest of them were mostly kind of very generic web application attacks, things like generic injections, generic directory traversals, which you see all the time. A lot of websites are not like well-known frameworks. They could be a custom code, the HTML that you've made for whatever your application is. Thus, there's a lot of very generic signatures to catch average web application attacks like SQL injection, and many of those were triggered, as you can see. And I did find the top 10, the 10th most popular exploit is also a generic signature that's used to find shellcode. When you have a vulnerability, like say a memory vulnerability, like a buffer overflow, after you trigger it, you're actually having to talk machine language assembly to get the computer that has been hijacked to get to the right pointer in order to actually execute code from a machine language perspective. So a NOP sled, NOP stands for no operations in assembly, is if you're just trying to find the right place in code and you figured out where you are in memory, you might just have to tell the CPU to skip, skip, skip until it gets to the point where it actually gets to your exploit code. So it's just a generic signature to catch those no operation sleds in shellcode. First time I remember actually seeing it on our top network attack list. So pretty typical network attack. If I remember right, 6 of these were repeats from the previous quarter. So only 4 of them were new to this quarter. And of those 4, I think only 2 were completely new, and the other 2 had been seen in previous quarters, just not the quarter before. But let's go ahead and move on to DNS Watch, Mark.
I think there's a question from the audience that this is probably a good a place as any to answer. So one of the things that we don't track in the report, or don't at least discuss in the report, are authentication related incidents, largely due to we haven't found a way to gain access to that telemetry data in a way that still protects privacy. But the question was, there's a global SSL VPN brute force activity that's going on right now, targeting exposed VPN services across every vendor that's out there, WatchGuard fireboxes, Fortinet devices, everyone. And they're asking, like, what are we doing to try and stop that or counteract it? Like, how are we combating this brute force attack? One of the features within the Firebox, another feature we don't discuss, is the botnet block sites list, which is basically a threat intelligence feed that we update throughout the day, every day on the Firebox of known malicious IP addresses. And we actually maintain our own honeynet of intentionally vulnerable and intentionally exposed Firebox devices around the world. So we get to see all of these brute force attacks impacting those devices. We take the IP addresses that we know are malicious from those attacks, which is generally anything trying to log into the honeynet because they are by nature not actually legitimate destinations. And we feed them into that blocknet blocked sites list to protect all of our customers against these threats that are out there. If you look up the WatchGuard Threat Lab GitHub account, there's a public GitHub organization out there. We also maintain a list of these IOCs updated on an hourly basis that you can use in any security service that you have out there. So hopefully that helps answer that question for you.
Yeah,
But
I'm going to add to it and kind of throw it back to the questioner too. Like Mark has just shared what we're doing to prevent the known IPs from doing this brute force. But just so you know, how the brute force is happening is not that like this brute force has even affected our AuthPoint service during one period of time. And what's happening is it's not directly request the auth point. What these guys are doing is they're finding open authentication portals, typically a open SSL VPN portal of not just fireboxes. We've seen Cisco equipment, Lixis, other competitors' firewalls, and they're of course trying a credential which is failing. But just so you know, things like our AuthPoint service are connected. We can use any IDP. We can add MFA to any SSL VPN portal that you want. So even Cisco devices can generate activity to us. But what I'm getting at is the other thing you can do as a user to help everybody in the industry, including other people that use AuthPoint, for instance, is by adding some hardening to, I mean, first of all, any authentication portal you don't have to expose to the entire internet, don't. There's access controls you can do, like management portals should never be exposed to the internet without VPN, and anything that you do have to expose to remote users, if you're able to have access control list and do it per IP. SSL VPN is obviously the one place where you sometimes have to expose the portal to the entire internet, but do know we have a feature where we're going to be able to allow VPNs, but we're going to disable that SSL VPN portal. But in either case, what I'm getting at is if you absolutely must expose a SSL VPN portal to the internet, there are things that will throttle brute forcers. There's features you can turn on that work. They don't work in every situation for our device, but other manufacturers like Cisco and others have them too, where if a user is trying to log on 10 times in a row and failing, after a certain amount of fails, it will auto block that IP for a period of time, maybe 15 minutes. But if it happens again from the same IP, it might auto block then for an hour and then for a day. So one of the things you can do to help the community, because remember, every failed authentication, if it's tied to other IDPs or MFA or any other equipment, that brute force may be affecting other infrastructure too. That sort of login throttling on failed attempts can really help everybody, not to mention yourself, obviously. So, good and interesting question.
So moving on to the last part of the Firebox feed, which is where we discuss three main buckets of malicious domains that are being used by threat actors over the quarter. Starting with malware specifically, this is any domain associated with delivering malware or command and control of malware, or otherwise interacting with malware-based threats. There was only one new addition this quarter. It was the domain pcdnbus-bk.a2, yeah, whatever. Basically, if you read our report last quarter, we discussed a IoT botnet that was targeting internet exposed televisions and DVRs called Pandora Sphere, which really exploded in our own telemetry in quarter 1 of this year. So this domain was associated with that botnet. We previously didn't see it in the top 10, but it's showing up now. And it's used as the command and control and CDN layer for this botnet. Basically, if your TV gets infected with Pandora Sphere, it joins up into this content delivery network that threat actors can use to ship around media files or infect other devices too. And this domain's associated with that. I guess one thing before I continue talking about these malicious domains that should hopefully go without being said, but by Nate, all of these are malicious. Do not go browse to them in your web browser because it might be hosting and likely is hosting an attack. We're just talking about them to give you some visibility into the threats we're seeing. In malware domains, we also saw a bunch of returnees for command and control for Darkgate, which is another malware loader as well too, that was pretty prolific over the quarter. Looking at compromised websites, these are legitimate websites that attackers have exploited a vulnerability on to host something malicious. Commonly, they're like WordPress websites that are suffering a vulnerability that let the attacker gain code execution and upload something. It could be a malware payload. It could be a watering hole attack, like in some other circumstances. But they are otherwise good websites. And the first one that stood out was a website called munlamet.com and its subdomain 2, which was associated with a Chinese-speaking threat actor using them as a watering hole attack against followers of Tibetan Buddhism. So it specifically targeted individuals from India, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and the United States by compromising this website for the Kagyu Manlam festival in India, and then injecting malicious JavaScript that would verify the victim's location, so make sure they were from one of those specific regions, and then if so, it would render a fake crash notification, make it look like your Chrome or Firefox web browser crashed, and it's got a little button in there that says immediate fix. And if you click that button, it kicked off a chain of malware droppers and delivery that ultimately dropped and executed the Night Door backdoor malware variant. So this was clearly a Chinese-based threat actor, just understanding the geopolitics in that area around Tibetan Buddhism, probably a nation-state-backed threat actor going after followers of this religion that they're trying to snuff out there by going after the legitimate websites that people might visit to deliver malware to them. Another one was the uniodonto.coop.br, which was another compromised website hosting a fake error message. This one was really interesting, though, where the error message fix button gave the user a PowerShell script and told them to run this PowerShell script on their computer. But the script itself was actually hosted on the Binance blockchain, which is a variant of the Ethereum blockchain run by the cryptocurrency exchange Binance. So the malware loaded up a Ethereum JavaScript library so that the web browser could interact with the blockchain. It would then query a smart contract, so a wallet address on the blockchain, and then pull out the PowerShell script from a data variable in that smart contract. And this is interesting because like blockchains are, especially Ethereum, immutable, meaning once something's on there, you can't take it off, which means this is a way to host malicious PowerShell, malicious something in a way that is literally impossible to pull it offline. In comparison, if this was just a
I hate
PowerShell
saying
script that you were,
literally. The only way is if you forked it, right? I mean, there are very rare cases where blockchains are forked to get rid of one type of one part. And although
extremely
that's
rare
not like
because it's
targeted to a single
yep,
attack on so it would be very hard to get rid of this.
extremely rare and very controversial in
Yeah.
the cryptocurrency and blockchain space. So it basically means it's a way to host something malicious in a way that can't be taken down. Like obviously, different defensive tools and controls can identify that PowerShell script and block it like after it's been retrieved, but it will always be there on the Binance blockchain unless they decide to fork their blockchain, which
And
is
frankly, even
probably
if
not
they
going to.
fork it, the original blockchain still exists. Everyone just knows to move away from. So in reality, it will still always be on even the old version of the blockchain.
Yeah. So I think we finally found a use for blockchains and cryptocurrency, Corey. That's fantastic.
It's all
Um,
good. There won't be regulation now. Everyone will start using it because we know they're totally safe.
exactly. Moving on to the last category, we look at domains associated with phishing attacks against people. And this quarter, there was actually no brand new additions. It was all returning websites and phishing attacks that we had seen in previous quarters, sometimes dating back several quarters or even a year. One of the main trends that we saw return, though, were a lot of threats that were hosted on legitimate cloud hosting services. You'll notice the top two were SharePoint subdomains, where an attacker can go register whatever subdomain they want of SharePoint, host whatever they want up there, so like a fake login form for Microsoft 365, for example, and gain success tricking victims because they just see it's SharePoint.net or SharePoint.com, which has got to be a legitimate website, right? When in reality, it's preying on people that don't know that attackers can host whatever they want on otherwise legitimate websites. It's a pretty common trend we've seen quarter after quarter, and it was one of the biggest trends that we saw this quarter when it came to malicious domains. But moving on to talk about a few of our tips from the Firebox feed, and
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and take the first one, Corey, if that sounds good. So
Yep.
the first main threat is really boiling down to reducing the incentives and the opportunities for threat actors to go after you as an organization. Like you'll often hear attackers being described as lazy. In reality, they're opportunistic. They will go after low-hanging fruit wherever they can find it. So if you have a internet exposed server that you haven't kept up to date with the latest security updates, that's a prime target for threat actors to go after. So one of the things you can do to reduce the chance of you suffering a breach or getting compromised is to just reduce your overall attack surface by limiting exposed systems wherever you can and adopting a zero trust approach to your network security to limit the blast radius of these attacks as well. Corey, you want to grab the second one?
Yeah, sure. And the second one is kind of pay close attention to management systems. And I'll be talking about this in a different way at the end of our report, too. But in the IPS section, one of the things I mentioned was that .cms content management system vulnerability, which was a directory traversal attack. And remember, a directory traversal attack just means, in this context of a web server, a bad guy can move from the normal web directory where all the HTML files are are and the visitor is supposed to see to some other directory. And while that may seem like a small deal, it's really a big deal because there's some other directories that might be executable. So a lot of times they'll put like a Python or Perl shell, a web shell on one of your on an executable directory on your web server. But anyways, there's many management systems that use that .cms content management system. I mentioned one, but Trend Micro's management uses it. Oracle Application Testing Suite does. Zoho Manage Engine uses it. And the point is, though, these administrative management systems, while it's part of like a web-based framework, they shouldn't be exposed to the internet in the same way as, say, your website. Making sure to separate those management systems from the actual data that you need for a website is very important. And later on, I'll talk about a lot of different security things you can do for other management systems. You know, not all management systems are web based, but that's one of them. But the first tip, of course, is just try to avoid exposing any sort of management system, this web based management system, to the internet. Now, I know we live in a remote world where remote based management is convenient if people are working from home or traveling. But again, there are other ways to allow remote management that are way more secure, like VPN. But I'm sure
Convenient
you'll
for
finish
you
off.
also means
Say,
convenient for the attackers,
yes,
unfortunately.
exactly.
And then the final tip from the Firebox section, or Firebox feed section, is just check your sources. What we mean by this is one of the oldest techniques in the book for attackers is to hide their malware by making it look like a legitimate piece of software. That could be they just copy the name and branding for it. Could be they inject it into an actual previously legitimate piece of software and then host that somewhere. But ultimately, they're trying to trick you into executing their malicious stuff by making it look like something that you might actually want or might be searching to go install on your computer. They often leverage techniques like Google search hijacking to make their bad version of something appear really high in the search results. So, like if you go search for free antivirus, there's no guarantee that the first couple of those might actually be a real virus and not antivirus. So, really, this boils down to when you are looking for software or applications, be mindful about where you are downloading them from and make sure you're getting them from the legitimate sources that are out there. Like there's a risk when you're just searching for something versus going to the manufacturer's website and finding their software downloads link there. And just be mindful that just because something is the top search result in Google doesn't mean it is the actual legitimate result within Google. For
Cool
time's
tip,
sake,
Mark.
though, let's
Yeah.
hop into the endpoint section.
Yeah. So, of course, now we're going to cover threats, but from the context of the endpoint. And just a reminder, this is based on the telemetry from the WatchGuard products like EPDR, which is endpoint protection and detection and response, as well as 8360, which is really the Panda version of that before we acquired the company. I did kind of preview this at the beginning when we were talking about overall highlights, but one of the big things that happened in Q2 is endpoint malware is down too. You can see we actually had a big bump in endpoint malware in Q1 2024. Uh, this, by the way, when we're sampling endpoint malware, that 173,000 isn't all the samples we saw. We have endpoint detection on literally tens of millions of computers, but we only sample 100 at a time to get these trends, or 100,000 at a time, if I remember correctly, to get these trends. Just because it's such a huge data lake, it's hard to get more from that particular team. So there's probably millions and millions, hundreds of millions of actual malware detected from the entire amount of endpoint software out there. But nonetheless, the sample we look at, it is dropped in Q1. But why don't we get into some of the technology, Mark?
Yeah. So we also look at how malware threats are caught and also how they originate or start on an endpoint. But looking at how we detect them, EPDR and 8360 are actually a collection of a whole bunch of different detection capabilities. There's the traditional signature-based detection capabilities like knowledge packs, where we look for specifically known threats. We also use machine learning and behavioral analysis on the endpoint itself with multiple different models built into it to catch different types of threats. But if the endpoint on its own can't reach a determination on definitively, is this good or is this bad, if there's any uncertainty in there, it can also leverage our cloud based services too, where we can use a larger data lake of knowledge of potential threats, query it based off there, can even run behavioral detection in the cloud or leverage our machine learning models up there too. But long story short, when it came to the detection technology that caught the most threats this quarter, or at least that had the biggest change this quarter, cloud-based detections increased 400% compared to the previous quarter. And that's paired with a decrease in threats that were detected using the on-device capabilities. And really what this means is we saw, just like with the network attack section or the malware at the network perimeter, more evasive threats on the endpoint where it's difficult for legacy security controls to make a determination definitively good or bad. And so we're having to rely on more robust controls that have to leverage the power of the cloud and our compute resources up there to make that definitive determination. We also saw a roughly 10% increase in threats that ended up all the way at the end of this detection capabilities at a human being on our malware analyst team to make that final thumbs up or thumbs down determination. That's one of the benefits of the zero trust application service within EPDR and 8360, where at the end of the day, if it can't make a strong it's good or it's bad, we have a team of malware reverse engineers that make that final call so that you don't get a suspicious file that you have to go and do that analysis yourself. You just get a it's good or it's bad, and we've made that call for you, which is one of the great benefits of this tool. Moving on, one of the other things we track is how did the malware attack start? Like, what was the main category of technique that the threat actor used in order to kick it off? Did they like exploit an application on the endpoint? Did they use an Office file or go after your web browser? Well, most commonly this quarter and as far back as I can remember, threat actors leveraged scripting capabilities on the endpoint, with roughly 53% of all the malware attacks we saw originating with a script of some sort, and the overwhelming majority of those being PowerShell specifically. But even beyond that, living off the land technique, we also saw another 28% leveraging the built-in Windows operating system capabilities and applications, around 28%. So roughly 81% of all the malware threats we saw leveraged living off the land techniques and some capabilities. Could be a script, like the majority of those, or using something like WMI exec or PS exec, or even your cert util in some instances too, to start that threat, because that makes it, those capabilities are really difficult to detect from traditional anti-malware services and endpoint protection, and where EDR really becomes a requirement for catching them. Corey, you want to add anything before continuing?
Yeah, what I was going to do is actually kind of unprofessional because one thing, there's so much in the report. This webinar is designed to give you the overview, but we really want you to release the report. And one thing we're skipping for the endpoint section for time's sake is a lot of detail. Like we do have a top 10 list, which you can kind of see. I've shown the actual report on the screen. So just like we covered on the Firebox, there's a malware top 10 list. I'm not going to go over it on the call. We encourage you to check out the report. But one thing I will mention is one of the top malwares by volume was Fuzzbunch. I always want to call it Fuzzbench. Fuzzbunch is one of the hacking toolkits leaked by the NSA, I believe, in 2019. So it's a big deal. Another one will correspond with a tip we'll tell you in a second here. A lot of the malware we see both on the top malware list, you can see this one here that mentions KMS, but also PUPs. PUPs stand for potentially unwanted software or potentially unwanted programs, or PUAs is also how some vendors talk about it, potentially unwanted applications. And these may not be necessarily malware, but they're typically things like adware or maybe piracy apps. And we see KMS all over the place in the report. And just so you know, KMS, I forget what it stands, Key Management Server, maybe it's Microsoft Windows ever since like, I think it was maybe even Windows XP. Getting a license for it required this online process to connect to a server. And one of the common ways to pirate Windows is to download these auto KMS tools, which put a local server on your network that will kind of crack the licensing part of Windows to confirm a license. So these all are related to piracy. So I wanted to mention that. But while we're looking at the report, There's a ton of detail about all this malware, more detail about the sections Mark has gone over. And the particular author of this section, goes over threat hunting using MITRE frameworks. And he also runs our ransomware tracker. So he has a very deep ransomware section that talks about the latest groups that are popping up and things like that. So I won't go into any more detail than that. I just wanted to show you a bit of the stuff we're missing from the report. Why can I not move this now and get it off my screen? That's weird. But anyways, hopefully that was helpful. And are you still? Oh, here we go. I'm grabbing the wrong window. Let me just quit it for now. With that, I will go to our final protection tips. So the first protection tip is to aggressively manage aggressively protect your IT management systems, which is something, oh shoot, I keep on getting this on the screen, which is something I already mentioned in the last tips, but in context of web application management. In this tip, we just want to cover all the different ways to protect any sort of network management system. So one of the things I said right away is you do not want to avoid these management systems to the internet directly. Put them behind VPNs. Make sure they not only have MFA on the management login, but you should have MFA on whatever remote access you use, whether it's VPNs or another remote access tool like go to PC, or I don't recommend using that in a business context, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. The other thing is you should segment management systems from your normal network. What I mean by that is, internally, you might have a bunch of trusted servers that have data that should be on a different network segment than your normal users. Workstations of just employees browsing the internet and getting internet access, that should be a completely separate network. Then your management interfaces, anything that IT admins get to for management interfaces, put it on a complete separate network segment that's protected by like a firebox so that you have strong access control between these segments. Even your normal employees won't be able to access these management networks. When you're talking about anything that offers management, patch, patch, patch. .cms should be patched. If it was patched, that exploit we talked about, which was quite old, would not affect you. So make sure you patch that software aggressively. And lastly, I already gave this tip away, but multi-factor. If you expose management interfaces and they do have logins, at least if you have multi-factor, they'll be somewhat protected. Mark, why don't you take the next one?
Yeah, the next one's all about cultivating a skeptical but polite mindset among your users. And what we mean by this is phishing and social engineering remains one of the most popular attack tactics that threat actors are using. They're going after, as some would call it, the weakest link, or one of uh, most difficult pieces to secure within the overall threat exposure for your organization, and that's your users. And you want to make sure you build a culture internally to encourage your users to question anything that is unsolicited when it comes to content, and specifically reach out to people over a trusted channel to verify if something they received was actually legitimate or not. This is especially true when you're handling Office documents where users might not fully understand some of the risks that they could be exposed to with these applications that they may consider to be like actually legitimate or not. And so teaching them to build this culture of just skepticism, especially for unsolicited emails or phishing messages, text messages, whatever, is critical within an organization. You want to teach teams to be suspicious, avoid risky activity like enabling content within Office documents, and really just train users regularly through sessions to reinforce these habits so that you build a culture of polite skepticism to always verify that whatever they've received is legitimate or not, and try and stamp out one of these common avenues for threats. Corey, you want to grab
Absolutely.
the last one?
Yeah, but before I do, I noticed we did get a question from one of the audience that asked, what are your thoughts on restricting remote management to an allow list of public IPs rather than VPN access? And that is okay too. When I mentioned at the very least, if you can't do VPN, have an access control list, that's exactly what I mean. So for instance, if you You don't want to just expose management to everything on the internet. But if you have a list of known IPs, absolutely that will restrict it. Now, of course, the slight risk if those known IPs are home users, if they get hacked, people could get in through them. But that's much, much, much like exponentially less risk than just exposing it to the internet. I will say the one reason we recommend VPN often is it strangely is easier. Nowadays, a lot of the remote places we're coming from do not have a static public IP. We do have all kinds of support for things like DNS, which can help, but it's sometimes hard to create a hard list of public IPs to allow, unless you're talking about, offices, branch offices that have this strong static IP. So if you're doing dynamic IPs, VPN might end up being easier, or you would have to set up a tool like DNS to make sure to always give the latest public IP to rules, which is a little bit harder. But yes, just if you can't do VPN, a limited access list is definitely a good protection. With that out of the way, the final tip is pretty simple, and it's why I showed you some of the stuff from the report about the auto KMSs. Really, you should avoid piracy. And this is not just for legal reasons. Obviously, you don't want piracy in your business because it attracts liability. You may not only have a user that was the pirate be affected by some lawsuit, but your business could have a lawsuit if you're using pirated software. But the bigger issue is when I was showing the auto KMS stuff that shows up a lot in the pups, what I didn't mention is those come tied with malware very, very commonly. If you think about it, well, I guess there is a part of the pirate community that are just free software for everyone. A lot of the people aren't creating cracks for you for free. They might seem like they are, but they kind of monetize this by sometimes attaching very risky and dangerous software to their cracking software. So AutoKMS is one of those, torrent downloads that often come with a built backdoor or Trojan in it. The cracking server might work, but whoever packaged it up might have some malware there too. So don't just avoid piracy for legal reasons. Know that malware is very, very commonly attached to some of the pirated stuff you can get for free. I've even seen many ISOs, like if you're downloading the Windows ISO or any cracked game, often they come with directories that have malware as well. So that is the report. Thank you so much for listening. We'll wait for a few seconds to see if you have any other questions in chat,
There's
but
one that
otherwise we
came
can
in.
definitely go for it, Mark.
Yeah, so the question was, is it best practices to deny internet access from servers? And I'd say generally, yes, the best practice is you deny all traffic that is not explicitly required for whatever the system or application needs. And so if you've got a server, just thinking generally, where it doesn't need direct internet access, maybe you've got like a local relay for getting security updates on it or what have you, restricting outbound access could make it significantly more difficult for a malware attack to successfully compromise that server and beacon back home over a command and control channel. Obviously, that comes with some trade offs where generally most applications require some form of internet connectivity these days, and so you may need to handle that. But broadly speaking, understanding specifically what's required for your servers or applications or systems to function, allowing that and restricting literally everything else is a great best practice to adopt within your organization.
It looks like for the materials question, I think that might be one Liz can help with. We have less to do with where we publish the materials. But I do notice a question asking us what our opinions are requiring IKE v2 tunnels between WatchGuards and Cisco ISRs. I mean, in general, I'm not sure if you're kind of trying to specify something in particular, but IKE v2 tunnels are great, and we interop with many, many different products out there. It's a standard that's open, and there should be no issue with setting up VPN tunnels to us and whatever devices you have, whether they be routers, other firewall vendors, etc. and it's a secure way to connect those devices. So there's nothing wrong with it. Now, obviously, we can attest that Cisco's routers or security devices do all the security things we do. So hopefully they're configured well because you're opening access between those two networks. But as long as you have strong security, there should be no issue. Mark, is there anything in particular you can think he might be focusing
Nope.
on by asking that?
I think IKE2 is the standard protocol now you should be using for branch office VPN tunnels, and it, like Corey mentioned, interops very well.
Yep.
Uh,
Cool.
Thank you everyone for hanging out with
Yeah.
us. Again, there's way more in the report itself. Definitely recommend checking it out. And if you aren't a current listener of the 443 Security Simplified podcast and you want to listen to me making fun of Corey once a week for an hour uh, while
Yeah.
talking about security related topics, definitely check it out. Thank you all.
Cheers, y'all. Have a good one.